Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers for February 17, 2011, the 16th legislative day of the 2011 session of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Scott Slade, and coming up on tonight's program, Sunday alcohol sales may not be such a sure thing after all. The Senate leaders say they don't have the votes to pass it. Legislation allowing charter school students to participate in extracurricular activities at their resident schools clears a Senate committee. It's the end of the legislative week. We'll check in with Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report. We continue our leadership interview series tonight. More of our extended conversation with House Speaker David Ralston. Illegal immigration and reapportionment are a part of the topics this evening. And I'll be joined in studio for analysis with Buddy Darden, former state legislator and congressman who is senior counsel at McKenna Long and Aldridge, and Chuck Clay, a former state senator and partner at Brock Clay. It has been an interesting week. And all that's coming up tonight on Primetime Lawmakers. But first, let's go live to the Capitol, where passage of a Sunday sales bill is in jeopardy. And Wandy Lawson is there. Good evening.
Good evening, Scott. I don't know. Jeopardy might be putting it mildly. Senate Majority Leader Chip Rogers today says the Republican caucus put that Senate Bill 10 to a vote earlier, and support was in short supply. He says he's not going to push voters to decide whether or not Sunday sales of alcohol are permitted, even though he is the second signer on that legislation.
Look, it wasn't my issue coming into this session. I didn't have this at the top of my agenda. I supported it. I think it was a good idea then. I think it's a good idea now. But I didn't go around asking people. I was more interested in asking people, can you help support me on school choice? That's what I was asking my senators about. So I don't know where they were and where they are now, but the only official count we have is the one we have, and it's not really close.
I spoke with Senator Rogers later this afternoon, and he said most legislators did not come with Sunday sales as one of their top legislative agenda items, so don't expect to see that measure revived this year. However, Senator Rogers did work today with Senator Renee Unterman to move legislation through the Senate Education and Youth Committee this afternoon that could allow charter school students to participate in extracurricular activities at their local public schools. Senate Bill 55 was inspired by Rachel Sackett, who says her decision to pursue a rigorous math and science curriculum pushed her off the lacrosse team.
I'm still in contact with my former teammates and coaches who continue to express our shared wish for me to continue to be a part of the team. In order to stay close to lacrosse in the program, I currently assist in coaching the recreational U15 girls team that originally had ignited my passion for lacrosse. Unfortunately, this is no replacement for being able to play with my teammates at Mill Creek High School. However, this is not just about me. I represent a group of students that are currently in public charter schools which offer no athletic programs as an extracurricular activity.
This bill just simply says if you attend a public charter school in Georgia, you would be allowed to participate in extracurricular activities at the school in which you were zoned. And it also says that you have to apply, and the principal at the school could deny you that if there was just cause and the principal did so in writing.
The Senate Education and Youth Committee did approve SB 55 by a vote of 6-1 with one abstention. That bill now goes to Senate rules. In the House today, lengthy debate on a comprehensive bicycle safety bill. Despite questions about whether it would require bike lanes to be added to roads and what the penalties might be imposed on children who don't wear their helmets or ride safely, House Bill 101 did pass 93-73, and it moves over to the Senate. The House also voted today to perform criminal background checks on applicants for some nursing licenses. Representative Valerie Clark explains House Bill 99.
The board is receiving a large number of complaints against practical nurses, such as theft from patients, drug abuse, and most serious of all, patient abuse. They believe that this pre-screening, this would reduce the number of future complaints and most of all, protect Georgia patients.
HB 99 passed 156-9 and moves over to the Senate. Today, the halls of the Capitol were filled with white coats of nurses and nursing students who were here to lobby on behalf of their profession. Governor Nathan Deal spoke to the group this morning and weighed in with his views on health care.
I am one of those that believes that the federal government is not the one who should be directing us as to how we should handle health care, that is more of a state, local, and personal issue. But no matter which format this country ultimately decides, you will always be an important and integral part of making sure that we deal with the very critical issues that we know we are facing. Our state has the rather undistinguished distinction of being very high in childhood obesity and obesity in general. We know that hypertension, we know that poor eating habits, we know that the lack of exercise, and I'm condemning myself as I speak, all contribute to those very unhealthy things that happen to us. You are going to be an important part of what I consider to be the new wave of healthcare, and that is a public awareness of a change of lifestyle, a change of attitude, an importance and an emphasis on making sure that young people understand that they do need to get out and move around a little bit, that they don't need to just sit there and watch television or play on computer games every day.
Senator Renee Underman, who is a nurse, is sponsoring legislation to ensure that those calling themselves nurses have the educational background to back up that claim. She calls Senate Bill 67 the Nurse Title Protection Act.
There's a lot of people who work in nursing home facilities or daycare facilities or even in the schools, and they say that they are a quote-unquote nurse, but it does not quantify when they actually went to school, they passed a professional exam. So there's a big difference, and there's a lot of people who impersonate nurses.
And what is the danger to patient care with that?
Oh, there's a lot of danger because they're not professionally trained. They do not know how to take care of a person. And when you're dealing with very dangerous drugs and administering drugs that are mind-altering and physically altering, there's a lot of ramifications that could come from that, and it's very dangerous.
In the Senate today, passage of companion measures that would allow the state to enter into lease agreements of up to 10 years instead of the single-year contracts currently required. Senator Buddy Darden was questioned about whether Senate Resolution 84 and Senate Bill 37 would eliminate the competitive bidding process.
There will be a competitive bid on the rental property.
Will the senator further yield?
I yield.
One other question. On page 2 of your bill, lines 39 through 41, there's a reference to if there is a need to terminate a lease agreement that the entity that's leasing the space shall just notify the State Properties Commission. Under what circumstances could you terminate one of these long-term leases other than lack of funding?
Well, if there is a need to terminate one of the leases, first of all, that department would have to let the State Properties Commission know and give them 90 days notice so that they could enter into that agreement. In every lease that is drafted, there will be the language in there subject to annual appropriations, so that if the money is not appropriated by a certain legislature, then we'll know that that has happened and we'll have to end the lease.
Both SR 84 and SB 37 passed the Senate and now move over to the House. Also on the Senate floor today, Atlanta Senator Vincent Fort used a point of personal privilege this morning to express his outrage about being removed from the committee with oversight over the MARTA budget.
I was with one of my constituents last night, and they didn't ask me about Sunday alcohol sales. You know what they asked me about? Something that is seemingly mundane. The bus route, the MARTA bus route that goes through their community. And I wanted to tell her that I was a member of the MARTA Oversight Committee, which I've been a member of for the last 10 years. But I couldn't tell her that because I've not been reappointed to the MARTA Oversight Committee. And you know what? That's okay. I don't need in order to have an impact, I don't need to be on anybody's oversight committee. Because I'm going to provide enough oversight by myself.
Senator Fort says he's going to oppose the 2012 transportation tax referendum because it will not provide adequate support to MARTA. And finally, movement today on a funding solution for the Hope Scholarship. Governor Deal and Republican leaders have agreed to cap the scholarship so that they do not rise with tuition. Details on that plan are expected to be announced on Tuesday. Reporting live from the Capitol, I'm Wandi Lawson for Primetime Lawmakers.
Been a busy week. Thanks, Amandi. Have a good night.
All right, good night.
It's the end of the legislative week, and that means it's time to check in with Tom Crawford of the Georgia Report. I talked with Tom earlier today. Began by asking him about action on immigration reform legislation this week.
Illegal immigration did not come forth for a floor vote yet. They have finished up the hearing part of it, and on the House side, I know they are doing some last-minute changes to the bills, what they call marking it up, getting it ready for a vote. But they still did not get to a floor vote in either chamber, but I think that's coming soon, possibly someday next week.
Odds on the Ramsey bill might very well be the one that winds up being considered?
That looks like the one that's moving a little more quickly than the other two, so yes, if I had to bet money, I'd say that'll be the first one to get a vote.
Well, always talking money under the Gold Dome. The latest of the budget. Let's talk about the amended budget, the one for this year.
The amended budget for this year passed the House last week. They're working on it in the Senate now, and I think they would want to do a vote on that in the Senate pretty quickly. There's not a whole lot of difference in what former Governor Perdue proposed last fall when he had state agencies cut their spending by 4%. Governor Deal continued that as well, so that's not a lot of major changes to what we call the mid-year budget, except to give the money that school systems typically get to handle increased enrollment. I think they'll be ready to move on that and pass it pretty quickly.
And meanwhile, the next one, the big budget for next year, maybe a pleasant surprise for budget writers. They might have a little more revenue to work with.
I think they might. Last Friday, the revenue numbers for January came out. There was about an 8.1% growth in state tax collections and state revenues. That's a little bit more than they had thought when they were putting the budget together, so that's good news. That's a good omen, people hope, and they may well have a little more money to work with than they thought, but they've still got some pretty big holes to fill.
Judicial reform got an awful lot of attention with just about every party on the front steps of the Capitol. Talking first, Tom, about perhaps reforming how we treat nonviolent offenders.
Governor Deal early in the session talked about the need to stop putting so many people in prison simply because they're drug addicts or because they commit a nonviolent crime, because the state just can't afford to house that many of them. Justice Carol Hunstein, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, joined that call this week in her State of the Judiciary speech. So there's a general agreement among the state's political leadership that we need to take a hard look at how we're sentencing people and maybe stop putting quite as many nonviolent offenders into what they call hard beds in the state's prisons.
And Sunday sales certainly has had a bit of controversy this week.
2 weeks ago, it looked like it was going to sail through. The religious conservatives have pushed back pretty hard on it. The Senate leadership said today that they took account of the Republican senators and they determined that there weren't enough votes among them to pass the Sunday sales bill in the Senate. So for the moment, it is just going to lie there. As we get into the Senate, and particularly as we get closer to the last couple of days of the session, I think you'll see an attempt made to revive that somewhere. So I don't think we've heard the last of the Sunday sales issue.
It's always great to talk to you, Tom. Thanks for the update.
Thank you, Scott.
And there's more to come on Primetime Lawmakers. In just a moment, we'll have more of Mwandi's interview with House Speaker David Ralston, and then in-depth analysis with Buddy Darden and Chuck Clay. That's going to be a lively discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers. And our leadership segment tonight, extended coverage of Mwandi Lawson's conversation yesterday with House Speaker David Ralston, beginning with his views on immigration reform.
I think Georgians have a right to expect that we're going to protect their interest here within the state. It is very true that immigration is largely a federal issue. Washington has failed to act on immigration now for a number of years. And as a result, I think that it's appropriate for the states to look to see what measures they need to take to protect their own state interest. I'm particularly troubled by the fact that last spring the federal government, after not having done anything on this issue, sued the state of Arizona, one of our sister states, because they did take a proactive measure. That disturbed me very, very much. I think there are really three parts of the illegal immigration issue. One is public safety. Two is state benefits. That's having access to taxpayers' money for different things. And the third is employment verification. It's a very tough issue, and I understand both sides of that argument. I also know that we have now lived in this country for over 2 centuries, calling ourselves a nation that lives under the rule of law. We have rules in place, so I think we need to acknowledge, are we going to follow those rules, or are we going to ignore those rules for a lot of people that are here in this country? I think that the people of Georgia have a right to expect that we're going to insist that people play by those rules.
Sounds like it's a tough issue to tackle, though, in that you have obviously the farm industry coming in and weighing in on with its perspective about its need for labor and so forth. Does it look like something that can actually be wrapped up during this legislative session?
Well, we're working on it. We've got a legislative package that's now in the Judiciary Non-Civil Committee. I anticipate over the next week or so they're going to make some decisions down there and make some decisions about whether they want to move forward with a package of reforms. And so I think Georgians have a right to expect that we are going to take some action on this issue.
And that we've had our census, it's time for redistricting again. We heard from Senate Democrats that they are concerned about the cancellation of the contract with the Carl Vinson Institute and a feeling that they're being cut out from the process and perhaps it's more partisan than usual. And I'm wondering, what were some of the thoughts that went into kind of restructuring how reapportionment will be handled?
Well, let me tell you how we're going to handle reapportionment this year. We're going to handle it in a way that is legal, that's sensible, and that's constitutional. I don't know what the end result of that will be, but we have a model of what not to do. And the model of what not to do is what came out of this building in the year 2001, the last time we went through this process. And so the same people that are squawking about us somehow making this a partisan process were the same people that drew some of the most ludicrous maps in the nation only a few short years ago, and maps that had to be declared unconstitutional by a federal court. And they were utilizing the same group that we decided not to utilize this year. And so I don't think that's being partisan. I think that's being constitutional, and that's being legal. We're going to be fair and inclusive in this process. We know that there's going to be litigation at the end of the day. There always is on reapportionment. But we're going to draw maps that I think the people of Georgia are going to find are fair and sensible and meet constitutional muster at the end of the day. The only change in what we did this year was to bring Georgia in line with what virtually every other state in the nation is doing, and that is recognizing that redistricting has always been a legislative function. And we were outsourcing it in Georgia. So we've just decided that we're not going to outsource it anymore. We're going to bring it back in-house where it ought to be.
Representative David Ralston was elected Speaker of the House in 2010. He represents House District 7, including portions of Fannin, Gilmer, and Dawson counties. A promised leadership interview with House Minority Caucus Chair Brian Thomas will be seen on Tuesday's Primetime Lawmakers. We turn now to our experts, our panel for in-depth analysis this evening. And while not the most active of legislative weeks, this week has seen some movement on illegal immigration matters, passage of the FY 2011 amended budget by the House, calls by state leaders from all three branches of government to change the way Georgia sentences nonviolent offenders. And today, the announcement that the Senate is not likely to pursue the Sunday sales bill. And we have some things to talk about. For analysis perspective, I'd like to welcome our panel of legislative experts, including Buddy Darden, former state legislator and congressman who's a senior counsel to McKenna Long and Aldridge, and Chuck Clay, former state senator and partner at Brock Clay. Thank you both for joining us this evening. It's great to have you on set tonight.
Thank you, sir.
Well, thanks, Scott.
Going to be a good discussion. A few minutes ago, we saw that Speaker Ralston said we could expect some sort of illegal immigration reform this year after the English-only driver's license bill failed. What do you think?
Well, let me make one point before we do this.
Yeah.
Today is day 16 out of 40. So we're 40% over with this legislative session, and not a whole heck of a lot is going on. So I think you're going to see the action have to pick up quite dramatically. And if this is going to be a successful session, you're going to see a very, very busy rest of the session.
Well, you serve in the State House.
Well,
Senator
what's
White?
going on now, obviously, is so driven by the economy. To answer your question on immigration, and there's many that would say the less done by the General Assembly, the better off the people of Georgia are. There are I think some things gelling up in the immigration area where you're going to see some consensus. I do think you'll see some level of the E-Verify. I think there'll be some protection for say contractors, businesses that have subs or that would limit liability. So they would be responsible for their own, but those that are further down the food chain they would answer directly themselves as opposed to creating additional liability on some of our largest and most significant employers. I also think you're going to see it's pretty tough nut to crack with the agricultural crowd. I suspect you're going to see some kind of exemption or some somewhat different parameters when you're dealing with the agricultural sector. But I think they are moving towards getting some consensus on a couple of these thorny aspects of the immigration issue.
How about it, Buddy? What do you think about the idea of avoiding future lawsuits here, whatever the state?
You heard me say, first do no harm, and I think we've got to be very careful in this immigration area. As the Speaker himself says, it's a federal issue. I know the federal government hasn't done its part, but at the same time, I think the least amount of damage we do in an immigration bill, the better, because, again, we've got to have the onions harvested in Vidalia. We've got to do a lot of things in this state which we could not do without this immigrant labor. So we've got to remember that we've got to keep the poultry industry alive. We've got to keep the agriculture industry alive. So let's proceed cautiously.
And I guess too, the real numbers need to come to bear on just what a drain, if it is a drain on parts of our economy, that it truly is. I mean,
you don't want. You got to try to keep. This is such a tinderbox. You've got to try to keep the emotion and some of the meanness that can drift in. However, Georgians in this economy do expect their leaders to do something.
I agree, but most studies show that as far as the money goes, it's a wash. A lot of people pay Social Security on fraudulent numbers, for example. Social Security numbers goes into the trust fund, will never be called upon. There are a lot of taxes withheld on fictitious Social Security numbers that, will never be refunds sought against. So I think it's a wash when it comes down. Of course, we've got to provide more services for these people, but in the end, financially, I don't think it's that big a deal one way or another.
I give credit for a lot of criticism, but this is an issue that could have exploded over, and I want to give credit. I think they have tried very diligently to focus on the doable and try to keep some of the other aspects of that debate out of it. So far, it's a fine line to walk. I think they've done a pretty good job.
Absolutely, that bill, Scott, by the way, that had English only for the driver's license. Everyone knew that that was a mean-spirited attempt aimed solely at immigrants, and it would not stand the constitutional muster. And I commend the House for burying that bill because I think it was a terrible idea whose idea will never come, hopefully.
That's certainly been never happened before.
Oh, of course not.
Well, I mean, the interesting dynamic between the House and Senate. Chuck, former Senator, Buddy, former state House member, and Sunday sales in the news today. Is that a prime example of the different dynamic and how that bill is proceeding or not proceeding now, the difference of what's going on in the House and Senate?
A couple things, and certainly Buddy can comment too. The Senate, while the House has sort of moved to a traditional sort of power base with Ralston really taking control and providing leadership, the Senate has changed the rules and in essence has moved to governance by committee. And these are all really smart folks, but that has created a milieu, and I'm trying to be as nice as one could be about discussing, but it has created a milieu where, who's on first a little bit, and some very smart, capable people, but it's a work in progress. And a classic example would be this liquor bill, because if you wanted to get this thing passed, there was about a 3-day, 4-day, 5-day window where simply if whoever the leader, whoever the person in charge had put this on the floor, it would have passed. Now, it may have split the Republican caucus, but it would have passed. And delay, of course, is always the enemy to either good or bad legislation, whichever way you want to look at it. But it's a different. We used to always think the Senate was the great restraint to all the zany stuff from the House.
Of course, the House
and now
is the stability and the leadership now.
Oh, here we go.
In all fairness to the Senate, as Chuck says, they're finding their way. They're kind of groping because the leadership is not very clear right now which direction they're going. It's kind of like, reminds me of a church committee trying to run things, and it just can't be done.
Ultimately, somebody's got
to be,
and somebody will emerge,
and it'll work itself through. But right now, it's not a very good day for the Senate. Let's just put it this way.
Last night we had Lester Tate, president of the State Bar of Georgia, on the program, and we were talking about judicial reform. A remarkable scene in front of the Capitol with the governor, lieutenant governor, members of the Supreme Court, members of both parties talking about reforming our judiciary. And Lester Tate said Chief Justice Hunstein's warning that underfunded courts could force criminal defendants to be set free. Is that a real possibility, and has that kind of thing ever happened before?
I don't think that's going to happen in Georgia. I realize that, and I support Justice Hunstein and Lester Tate, who incidentally was a former press secretary of mine when I was in Congress. So
told me that.
I'm a very, very strong supporter of Lester, but I really think that there will be some give and take on this issue. And luckily, Governor Deal seems to understand the situation, frankly, better than his predecessor.
You're talking to two former prosecutors here. To me, and Buddy would, I'm sure, would say this is not so much an issue of criminals being set free as it is resources. How do you best spend the resources when 90% of your inmates are there for drug and alcohol-related offenses, some of them extremely serious for murders, some of them not so serious as to possession? How do you devise a system that has the flexibility to get those who don't need to be in prison in settings where they're dealing with drugs and alcohol and the really bad folks there where they need to be forever?
That was Mr. Tate's point, as far as funding is concerned and slopping over that. Do you think we're going to see real reform?
That's a very important point I want to bring up, because today I went to the Newsmaker luncheon for the Atlanta Press Club and heard Speaker Ralston discuss this very issue. And he said, and I wrote it down just to be sure I understood it, that they wanted to cut the prison population by 1/2. Now that is a very, very difficult thing to do. And for the entire time I was in the Georgia legislation, the entire time I've been observing, people are trying to pour it on and put more and more penalties. So I think we're going to have a total redirection.
You're going to have to put more resources up front to save at the back end. You can't just let a prison population out. If you're not going to get into rehab and you're not going to get into serious policing and monitoring of those on parole,
courts,
probation,
like drug courts,
all these things. And it takes people and it takes money, but it will save in time.
We have to invest on the front end to save money on the back end.
One more quick thing here. The Savannah Harbor, $600,000 in the new federal budget proposed by the Obama administration. That's not even a drop in the river, so to speak.
That won't move up here.
Right.
Nobody will come out and say it in the congressional delegation, but this is embarrassing. The fact that we have just had them thumb their nose at us. And $600,000, we don't need another study. They've been studying this thing for the last five years.
This is Georgia. This is one of the underpinnings of our ability to grow this Georgia economy. And if we're not in a position where we can bring these super tankers that are going to be going through the revamped Panama Canal, that traffic's going to move somewhere else. They have to do something.
This is why not all earmarks are bad. That's why you have people in Congress to look out for their own state and their own issues. I realize they might have been abused in the past, but this is the time for the Georgia legislators in Congress to get busy and earmark money for this port.
Thank you both for joining us. We can talk all night. It's great to see you, Chuck. Good to see you again, buddy. Thanks for coming this evening.
Thank you.
That's all the time we do have. Thanks for joining us tonight. The General Assembly is not in session tomorrow on Monday, so Primetime Lawmakers will not be seen at 7, but join us for Primetime Politics instead. Tomorrow's program features a discussion on public safety and how to pay for it. That's tomorrow night at 7 here. When Primetime Lawmakers returns on Tuesday, we'll bring you another installment in our Leadership Interviews series. House Minority Caucus Chair Brian Thomas' schedule, plus in-depth analysis on important legislative issues and the latest Capitol news. Primetime Lawmakers returns Tuesday, February 22nd at 7 p.m. See a repeat of this broadcast tomorrow morning at 5:30 right here in GPB. And coming up next, Georgia Outdoors. Herons and Heroes join Sharon Collins as she explores some of Georgia's amazing wading birds. Georgia Outdoors is next, so stay tuned. That's our broadcast for the 16th Legislative Day of the 2011 session. Thanks for joining us.
This is a GPB original production.